It was the last, like, there was a holiday the next week, and then there was something like that. She probably talked about it forever, and they were saying
Good evening and welcome. My name is Alice Greenwald. I'm the director of the 9/11 Memorial Museum, and I am delighted to welcome you this evening. I want to add special greetings to the museum members in the audience tonight and those joining live via our webcast. You know, one of the great privileges of my position is that I get to introduce many of our esteemed speakers. But it is particularly meaningful to me that tonight we are welcoming a scholar of memory, a longtime colleague, and a very dear friend, James Young. Before I share James' impressive resume, I want to share a personal story. A few years ago, James and I were driving together up to Massachusetts on a rainy Friday afternoon. The traffic getting out of New York City was horrendous, and a ride that would normally take about 2.5 hours ended up taking about 5 or more. And we were anxious about arriving late to a dinner that James was hosting and I was attending, so we distracted ourselves by sharing how each of us had arrived at careers focused on memory. Well, we had known one another ever since James wrote about the Holocaust Museum in Washington, where I had worked for about 20 years. What we didn't know was that we were pretty much the same age. We had both spent time in Norway in our teens. We had both concentrated in the history of religions in our graduate work. And we had both started our careers with a focus on Jewish culture, only to evolve into Holocaust studies, and then onto questions surrounding commemoration, memorials, and memorial museums. So in short, I learned that James is actually my secret twin. And you know I could do a lot worse. Since 1988, James has taught at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where he has served as Distinguished University Professor of English and Judaic Studies and Director of the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies. He's also taught at New York University and Bryn Mawr College and was a visiting professor at the University of Washington, Harvard University, and Princeton. James has spent his career focused on the issue of memory in public contexts, beginning with Holocaust memory and memorials, and then becoming one of the foremost thinkers about the process of memorialization itself, the construction of memory in public spaces. He's the author of numerous scholarly articles and books, including Writing and Rewriting the Holocaust, The Texture of Memory, and At Memory's Edge, After Images of the Holocaust in Contemporary Art and Architecture. While widely acknowledged as an expert and a scholar of rare ability, James has not dedicated his talents solely to teaching and to writing. He served as a guest curator for an exhibition at the Jewish Museum here in New York entitled The Art of Memory, Holocaust Memorials in History. The exhibition traveled on to venues in Berlin and Munich. And he has applied his insights and knowledge to the practice of commemoration. In 1997, he was appointed by the Berlin Senate to the 5-member Commission for Germany's National Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe, which selected Peter Eisenman's design, completed and dedicated in May 2005. In 2003, James was appointed by the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation to be on the jury for the World Trade Center Site Memorial Competition. The winning design, submitted by Michael Arad and Peter Walker, was dedicated on the 10th anniversary of 9/11. And as you all know, having just walked through the Memorial Plaza, the 9/11 Memorial now sits at the heart of a revitalized Lower Manhattan, envisioned for us by Daniel Libeskind, who has graced us with his presence tonight, along with his wonderful wife, Nina. We welcome you. And I also want to extend a warm welcome to Michael Arad, who's joining us, and Michael McKeon, one of James's fellow jurors. From the very start of the effort to create the 9/11 Memorial Museum, James served as one of our most valued advisors. Most recently, he contributed an afterword to our most recently published book, No Day Shall Erase You, From the Memory of Time. And for the past 3 years, he and I have consulted together with Cliff Channon, our Senior Vice President for Education and Public Programs, who also happens to be the moderator for tonight's program. We've worked together on multiple memorial efforts in Norway to commemorate those so tragically killed in the July 22nd, 2011 bombing of the Oslo Government Center and the massacre on the island of Utøya. Tonight, we are privileged to hear from James about what he calls the stages of memory, which also happens to be the title of his newly published book, The Stages of Memory, Reflections on Memorial Art, Loss, and the Spaces in Between. Please join me in welcoming James Young.
Thank you, Alice, and welcome, everybody. This is a bit of old home week tonight because Alice has told you her history with James. Mine is not as long, but it was capped this summer when the three of us, along with Ed Linenthal, were in Norway for the opening of one of the memorial sites for the July 22nd attack there. We'll talk about that a little bit in the course of this evening. But James, I wanted to pick up something that Alice talked about because, you know, through your work and through your teaching, it does seem to me that you have been at the center of a field that has grown roughly contemporaneously with your career, this field of memory studies. And I wanted, because we're all part of it, I mean, the people who are here, who are concerned with this, are part of a process that you describe in a number of cases. But I'd like to sort of hone in just to start on what that field is and how it differs from some of the other disciplines that you've been associated with in your career as well, whether English, Jewish studies, history, and so on. So help us understand the field and help us understand what makes it distinct.
For me, it began writing my dissertation and writing big chunks of it in Europe at various concentration camp sites, doing research at Auschwitz, at Buchenwald, Dachau, doing research at YIVO here. We have in the audience Sam Norwich, who was the director of YIVO. In 1980, when I showed up in New York, 1979, I walked in there, a scruffy graduate student.
It's very hard to picture you as scruffy, I will say.
And Sam offered me a fellowship at YIVO on 86th Street at Fifth Avenue. And I spent my first year there before moving to Israel. So that would have been 79, 80, and then moved to Israel, where I wrote the rest of my dissertation. With faculty including Yehuda Bauer and Saul Friedlander and Sidra Ezrahi, who gave me permission to examine not only how the Holocaust was getting passed down in narrative and literature, but to see how it was being passed down to us in physical sites of memory. And this began with a slideshow I brought back, I think it was in 1981. I spent much of the summer in Poland and Germany researching. And by researching, I was looking at Sonderkommando diaries at Auschwitz, which they have in the archives, but I couldn't help but look up and see where I was actually examining these things. And at that point, the table, the chairs, this would have been in one of the barracks at Auschwitz I, where the library was. And I wandered outside in the guard towers and the gravel and the tourists. And then I realized that I would have to examine both. I needed to understand both what happened and how what happened was getting passed down to me. That is, I need to examine both the history of the events and how the history was being remembered to us and being enshrined in these memorial sites. And again, I had mentors like Saul Friedlander and Sidra Ezrahi in particular, who gave me that permission. Said, yeah, tell all of it. And so I did. And this was in the era, late 70s, early 80s, when theory theory was in vogue. Roland Barthes was writing about McDonald's arches and wrestling matches. And we kind of were asking to write about everything, photographs and film, and we found a vocabulary for doing this. And again, probably at some point somebody should have stopped me, but they didn't. And this field, such as it is, understanding both what happened and how what happened is remembered, began to grow. And I wasn't alone. I felt a little alone at first, but actually when I came back in the company of Sam Norwich at YIVO and Sam's sister Anita Norwich, who was also exactly my graduate school peer. We were actually together in Israel in 81, 82. It happened in these kinds of conversations. And I found, in fact, that some of the most interesting work on kind of conversion of history to memory was taking place in Holocaust studies. I didn't know, if I had been maybe a scholar of the Russian Revolution, maybe we would have discovered a memory studies aspect of that. But there was so much intensive study of the Holocaust in that era, and all these different languages and all these different national traditions, that it became clear that we couldn't understand even archives or documentation without understanding their national homes and their national linguistic homes. And all of that became now a part of, I would call it cultural memory studies. Mm-hmm. There's still a lot of people out there who really think of memory studies as a cognitive discipline.
Which has a great dimension
also
to it,
has
of course.
It, yeah. And there's a great journal out there now, published by Sage, called Memory Studies. I was on the board from the very beginning. And I'd say about a third of the essays published in there are around war and national trauma and even Holocaust things. But the rest include cognitive studies, all kinds of ways, all kinds of memory forms.
Did this, as it was evolving, sort of move naturally and easily into relationship with other disciplines, or was this something that needed a push from those of you who were doing it?
Well, I found it was very early, and I talk a little bit about this in the book. The New England Holocaust Memorial Commission invited Maya Lin and me to give talks at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. It was 1987, pretty early. My book had just come out, Writing and Rewriting the Holocaust, and I was advising them on how to open up their process. They, like many people starting out, wanted a Holocaust memorial. They had an idea in mind. They actually wanted to take Nathan Rappaport's Liberation statue and make a copy and put it in Boston on the Freedom Trail. And I just said, and not only that, they wanted Nathan to use me as the model for the GI.
So you had gone past your scruffy stage by that point as well, yeah.
Right. That's pretty early on. And that night after our talks, Maya said, I showed lots of Holocaust memorial slides, and she showed her Vietnam Veterans Memorial slides. And remember, this is only 5 years after her design was dedicated in Washington, D.C. And she said, a lot of, I have two major debts, or my work has two major debts. One is to the memorial by Edwin Lutyens, the Battle of the Somme, or the Missing of the Somme in Thiepval, France. And the other is the memorial on the Ile de la Cité, in Paris, a Holocaust memorial. And so here is where that arc began in my mind. Okay, go back to World War I. This is in Maya's brain. Moved to this very early memorial. 1957 is when Henri Pangouchon was first designing this memorial for Paris. And those forms, both of them kind of underground. In Paris in particular, you have to descend and open up a space in the landscape, which, as we described it later, would be to open up spaces within us, for memory. Instead of coming up against a big monolith, instead opening up these spaces in the ground. And these so-called negative form monuments, or counter monuments, as I ended up calling them in their German context, and in the American context, Maya's design for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial is certainly America's greatest counter monument, counterpointing the great white monolithic neoclassic, monumental designs in Washington, D.C., and not meaning to nullify them or neutralize them, but sitting side by side. How to remember something that maybe the country is still very ambivalent about. And so she articulated in a way this terrible ambivalence that the country still felt toward the Vietnam vets. It was a design whose genius was not apparent in the first few stages, but which became very apparent by the time it got to the last stage by a system of passion votes. So here's, Maya describing this. We flash forward now through the Berlin Memorial process, the Jewish Museum in Berlin, come back to New York, and of course Maya and I were both invited to be part of this jury, 13-member jury for the World Trade Center site memorial design. And Michael Arad, proposes further voids. We have Daniel Liebeskind's voids in the Jewish Museum in Berlin. Got this preoccupation with negative spaces in the ground in all kinds of German Holocaust memorials. And now Michael Arad, who had studied both Maya's work and my books apparently at Georgia Tech for his master's in architecture, was here, watched the towers come down, proposed a design, if we wanted even to see that very early one, on his rooftop. He sketched in November 2001 2 gigantic voids in the harbor off the Battery. And he went up and built a water table on the top of his roof. There was no memorial design competition. It was just in him. This was a vernacular that did evolve out of all these other memorials and designs, and this reflected our preoccupation with what was lost and what could never be replaced.
So if we can pull up the slide of the water table on the Michael Arad roof, we'll do that. But let's talk a little bit more about this concept of negative space. You've called it the counter monument, counter memorial. And let's define why the negative space is so appropriate in the context of this modern memorial development.
I think really post-World War I, there's been a kind of a cultural preoccupation with irredeemability. Benjamin was already worried that historical narrative was redeeming events with coherence that they didn't have as they unfolded. How to write an event without creating too much sense. Saul Friedlander picked this up and has tried to address this in his own histories of the Holocaust. The German artists in particular, the post-war generation of artists and architects, and here I would include Daniel, even though he's not German, Polish-born. But this preoccupation with telling history and remembering history and articulating this terrible void left behind. 6 million Jews not coming back. Loss cannot be compensated, cannot be repaired. There is no Wiedergutmachung that can ever fill in this loss. How to articulate that void without filling it in became like this obsession for many of the artists. Daniel articulated them in his design for the Jewish Museum, and he used these voids actually to help interrupt and disrupt a very smooth, seamless narrative. She said, there is no seamless narrative of German Jewish history after the war, after the Holocaust. We have to house this memory without allowing it to be, without foreclosing these voids that remain to this day. And this was something that, after Maya Lin's negative form monument, which she described in her, in her proposal, like she said, I want to take a knife and cut it into the ground and then open up that ground as a wound that cannot be healed, and then polish the sides like a geode, almost like this. You've chopped this, this beautiful geode, and that's where you have the names. And thereby articulated this very first negative form memorial, which, according to the artists I know from Germany, Horst Hoheisel and Jochen Gertz and Esther Shadlev Gertz, even Misha Ullmann, the Israeli artist, made a huge impression on them. And the German artists in particular felt that for the first time they had an architectural aesthetic vernacular by which they could articulate the lost and missing Jews of Germany without filling that loss in, and without domesticating it or beautifying it in any way. Absence must be remembered with absence, loss with loss, emptiness with emptiness, and hence this flowering, if you will, of these negative form, invisible, disappearing counter-monuments in Germany, which of course, if there were only counter-monuments, that were disappearing in negative form, it wouldn't be enough. But they needed traditional forms to counterpoint, and that was part of their job. They didn't trust very traditional, conventional monumental architecture because they felt, in fact, in some ways, it was a fascist form of architecture. It was authoritarian. Big rocks telling people what to think. Gigantic memorials, Soviet-style memorials, kind of beating us into submission, the spectators feeling very small and insignificant. And Maya Lin, the only figures we have in her memorial design are humanly proportioned reflections, as we walk by. And it was meant to be humanly proportioned. And Jochen Gertz and Esther Shalev Gertz, who designed this disappearing memorial in Harburg, said that in the end, they wanted to return the burden of memory to those who came looking for it. Memory is in us. It is not in these forms. We occupy these spaces that these artists and architects have opened up, and we bring the memory with us. They don't remember for us. And they're also adamant about insisting that we don't allow our memorial work to serve as a substitute for action against contemporary persecutions. And as they say in their little plaque, which I just visited again after maybe 15 years away a couple of weeks ago, in the end, it is only we ourselves who can rise up against injustice. Our monuments don't rise up against injustice. We rise up against injustice. We are left behind when these monuments go away. And that I would say is kind of a thumbnail sketch of what these negative forms mean.
Let's come to, you've mentioned the Michael Arad design and the process of creating the 9/11 memorial and your role in the jury. You became involved in conversations about this before you were actually a juror, and I wonder if you can evoke that time, because certainly it comes at a time when there is this expectation that there would be a memorial. Forget about the fact that people didn't agree on what it would be immediately, but that there was a very widespread expectation that somehow the proper response to what had happened here was to make a memorial, which is very different from what might have been the case if 9/11 had happened 30 or 40 years earlier. That by then, by the time 9/11 happens, there is this sense of, okay, the answer to doing this, or the response to this, is we make a memorial. Now, that must have provided some moment of shocking recognition to you that this had become so popularized.
So early. Actually, Cliff was involved in the very earliest conversations as well. I remember Cliff convening as part of your legacy project.
Yeah, for the first anniversary.
These conversations on the first anniversary, when I think actually you got us up there on the stage and asked a question like, so will there be a memorial or is it too early?
Yeah.
And I think, I'm not sure if that was one of the ones where Paul Goldberger and I were doing things together with you, but the answer was always, it's too early. In fact, I'm not even sure it's memory yet. Yeah. It's unfolding history. Only for the families, only the families know what this means, and it means the direct, explicit loss of a loved one. The people downtown know, because it's the loss of this 16 million square feet of office space. Manhattanites know, Brooklyn, the boroughs know. But other than that, what is the meaning? Is it the beginning of a 30-year war on terror, or is it the beginning of a 30-year war of terror against us? We just didn't know. But we did know enough to ask everybody who asked us, and I mean at this point it was the mayor's office, first Giuliani's office, and then Mayor Bloomberg's office, and Governor Pataki's office, who called us in to ask what the memorial will be. I said, it's already begun, whether you like it or not. Think of it, instead of thinking of the memorial as an end result or worrying about how you're going to get there, take a deep breath, give yourself time, and understand that the memorial began with the candlelight vigils on the first night. And it continued through the posters and the flyers of the missing loved ones, thousands of them posted around the city and all the boroughs for weeks afterwards. Those too are not just elegiac, but they're like epitaphs, tombstone epitaphs. Think of those too as the memorial. Think of it as a process. Think about all the working through that all of us are trying to do, and don't worry about what it will be, and don't even worry about failing. And this was the guarantee we had to get from Governor Pataki at the very end. We worried a little bit because, in fact, Governor Pataki made the executive decision to choose Daniel's design over the Think Team design. They were the two finalists.
And this is the master plan design.
For the master plan, for the World Trade Center master plan. And he knew that the families loved Daniel's design, and he liked it also. Some of the critics and the Feinschmecker, leaning toward the Think design, and back and forth they went. So Pataki said, we choose this. So now we're on this jury, and we're meeting with him for lunch, and we said, so it's great that you chose the Liebeskind design for the World Trade Center site design project, but we need a promise from you that you're not going to veto our choice, or if we can't arrive at one, that you will object. We need to be free to fail. And I have photographs of Maya and myself and Michael Van Valkenburg.
In the book.
In the book.
Yeah.
Talking to Governor Pataki, asking him for this, imploring him. And he understood. He swallowed hard, grimaced, and said, okay, you're free to fail. But that's not what politicians like. That was not the road he wanted to go down. And but then we knew that we were going to be okay. We were not going to be choosing something out of a defensive posture, because we didn't want to fail. And we got there. And it wasn't easy. And
I mean, you detailed some of the extraordinary amount of work that went into this, and I don't want to dwell too much on that, but give us a thumbnail of what it took to get through 5,201 submissions, all the boards, everything being inspected, to come to, I think it was 8 finalists, and then ultimately the reflecting absence design that we see around us here.
A lot of time. So we received 13,800 registrations from over 90 countries around the world. And those registrations had to come in so that we would then, they paid $25 to register, and then the design management team sent them the booklet, the mandate. And then we received 5,201 submissions from 63 countries around the world. reminding all of us that, in fact, about a third of the victims of the 9/11 attacks were foreign nationals, and about 2/3 were American nationals. It's truly an international attack. And we spent the month of August 2003, long days, 8 to 10 hours a day, sometimes longer, 12-hour days, going up and down the rows. We viewed them 200 at a time, set up on the 30th floor of a Larry Silverstein building a few blocks away, complete secret place that we had to get there different directions every day so that the press wouldn't find us, and it was all very, very secretive, yeah, cloak and dagger. And Maya reminded us that her design was chosen by a passion vote by one of the jurors for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial competition. They had over 1,000 submissions, and she won. It was also an anonymous process. And one juror kept advancing her to the next stage until toward the end he could put up and finally describe what this design meant to this juror, and everybody else got it. And so then we winnowed things down. At one point, I think there was a story in the Post that said, oh, supposedly all the jurors are seeing all the memorials. Now, we did the math. There are 5,201 designs. At 12 hours a day, it will take them at least 30 days. And they were exactly right. That's what it took. So by November, we got it down to 8 finalists. At the end of August, I think we got it down to about 250. And at that point, we began conducting graduate seminars on memorial architecture, led by Maya and Michael van Valkenburg and myself in a couple cases, trying to divide all the submissions into thematic architectural categories: water, landscape, stone, sculptural, installation, sound, off-site, and to find the very best in each of those categories so that we were sure that we didn't leave a category out. We wanted to think of all of them, and we wanted something representative. We didn't have a category for bad design, and we actually were careful not to mock. So, I mean, there were a couple crazy designs, Apple with the plane flying into it, okay. But we understood by the texture of these boards just how many human hundreds of hours went into every single design, by big architectural firms and by small families at the dinner table. And if we multiplied all those hours by the 5,201 designs, then we understood why this process mattered. Now we have hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of hours spent by human beings working through their grief and trying to articulate their grief in a formal design. Mm-hmm. And that was so moving that we just had to, actually every day had to kind of thank the process for opening this space up where people would spend this kind of time, that the work was already done in a way. It didn't matter what memorial almost by the end. If we had that 5,201 times 500 hours each, that was the process. So we always saw this in its longue durée. And again, it's not easy submitting designs to somebody like Michael van Valkenburg and Maya Lin. They're pretty tough critics. The rest of the jurors, pretty tough, great aesthetic eyes. Susie Friedman from the Public Art Fund and Lowry Sims from the Harlem Studio Museum. And these are really smart people. Vartan Gregorian, kind of this great eminent, presence to keep us completely grounded, on the jury. And by the time we got to 8, we got to meet them all. Mayor Bloomberg gave us Gracie Mansion. He gave us his chef and his wine cellar. And
I'm surprised it didn't take longer then to go through.
It went pretty smoothly after that.
The wine would help, yes.
Yeah. All New York State wines, by the way. They were delicious.
I was worried about that. I want to get your sense of, here it is. It's been open since the 10th anniversary. 30 million people have walked by or come to see it. What's the difference between the real thing, the actual thing, and the thing you imagined in the sort of sanctity of the jury box? I realize there have been design changes through it, and that's not really what I'm asking about. I'm asking much more about what you envision the impact being and how you see the impact in the real interactions with visitors.
You know, we kind of worked this to death conceptually, free associating what this thing is going to do, the water falling down into voids, into further voids, the sound, the trees, the taller they grow, the greater the volumes of the voids will be. The taller the buildings around grow, the greater the voids will be, the deeper the voids will be. And we love the counterbalancing of loss with regeneration. Very different project from in Berlin, you know, where loss need to be articulated and not regeneration. The Jews, you know, didn't come back. You know, I mean, we have 100,000 Jews now in Germany, but mostly Israelis and Soviet Jews. So conceptually, we got this. We also felt that it was minimalist, negative form, horizontal. We had stitched the Memorial Plaza back into the grid of the city. We raised the grade, and that was crucial from the very beginning, that we raise the grade and not have a gigantic pit in the middle of the city. We wanted people to cross it on their way to the subway, on the way to the transit center. We wanted people to eat their lunches there. It had to be, again, a part of the living city, and to bring life back to the city was crucial. That said, about midway through construction, the jury met every year, by the way, actually twice a year. Mayor Bloomberg hosted us every year just as a way to thank us. And often we would meet right here to go down into the memorial under construction, put on our little hard hats. We each got one with our name on it, which was really nice. And Michael Arad would kind of lead the tour down into the voids, which didn't have any water. And I remember standing there with Maya and going, oh my God, it's much bigger than I thought it was going to be. And the size and the scale suddenly scared us a little bit. But then we realized that the memorial's mandate from the very beginning included articulating the footprints. And we're articulating footprints of two of the tallest buildings in the world, 200 feet square. There was no way around it. If that's going to be built into the design, we didn't want bombast, we didn't want monumentality, but the scale of the buildings were monumental. And so the scale of the footprints would also be monumental.
Let me add,
no matter what we did.
I mean, the monumentality, alas, is also reflected in the fact that the names are actually well and evenly distributed across these monumental spaces. The loss is also monumental.
You needed that much room to list, you know, the nearly 3,000 victims.
You know, if you think about the first responder names, there are 441 first responder names, it takes up something like 40% of the linear footage of the South Tower pool, which is, you know, it's mind-boggling when you think of what those numbers turn out to be.
It is. And those details were interesting. From the very beginning, there was real concern among the jurors on how to list names. And Michael Arad suggested from the start that he wanted the names listed in what he called meaningful adjacencies, which meant he wanted to ask every single family where they wanted their loved one's name to be and with whom. How are you going to do this? Well, they figured it out. I mean, it took an algorithm. It took a lot of time. Michael actually gives credit to a couple of his partners in his architecture firm. But they did it so that every single name is surrounded by those their families wanted them to be by, all the way around. Many of the first responders are together.
Yep.
And then there was the question of whether or how to distinguish first responders from the rest of the people killed on that day. And first responders' families were pretty insistent that they be remembered differently. They didn't want to privilege them, but they died civic deaths. They didn't die just personal deaths, but they died going to save people. They died climbing 80 stories with 80 pounds of equipment on their back to save people. And that's, we needed to find some way to acknowledge that they all died equally horribly. Their losses are the same for everybody, but acknowledge that they died in the civic good and the civic responsibility. And so we agreed to mark their names with ladder companies. In the case of the firefighters, our precinct numbers. In the case of police officers.
Yeah, the unit they served with. And seeing it today, I mean, we see it with the museum here. I mean, the planning. You open the door and it's not yours anymore. I mean, it takes on a life of its own. And so describe the life of the memorial today as a grown child that is off on its own in the world, and what does it look like to you?
It's pretty stirring. Came through, daylight savings time now gone. It was, dark. Beautifully illuminated, which we knew. I think many people like it more at night.
I think it's at its best then,
Yeah. It shows just beautifully. The sound of the water is very comforting. It's still something a little disturbing in the fallingness of it all. You remember that Pope Francis was here, was it a year ago?
September,
November?
yeah, September.
And he was taken through the memorial, I think, by you and Alice.
I'm not
Maybe
sure.
Maybe Alice.
Mayor Bloomberg, I'm not sure.
Yeah, Mayor Bloomberg. And then he described to the setting this ecumenical gathering in the museum here. And he just, off the top of his head, he said, the falling water, falling into these voids which cannot be replenished, reminds me of the endless tears that are falling by the family members, which can never fill up those lost souls who were gone. I mean, he made a poem out of it. It was pretty amazing. The voices I hear standing by, I do a lot of eavesdropping as I walk around.
It's very instructive.
Yeah.
It's very instructive.
And mostly from not New York, outside of the city, lots of other languages. I think New Yorkers are still, many of them are just trying to find their way back to the memorial. They don't think it's really, many think it's not really for them. Clearly it is. The families appreciate it very much. I mean, I think mostly there's really universal acclaim among families for the museum and the memorial, which has been great. But I think New Yorkers are just now trying to find it. I took a group of friends a few weeks ago. UMass Press had a little a party and a gathering, and several of my New York friends had not been to the memorial yet, and they said they didn't want to go. It took 15 years for them to come, but if they could be guided through by me, they would now come. But there were a couple people who came to the party who live 2 blocks away from here, who have still not been here, and who told me, and I cite this in the book, James, if you could design a place where we could go forget, we'd go there. It's too raw.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I want to skip now up to the Norway project, in part because I want to, at the end, talk about a comparison of the two and
Sure.
what the difference of scale.
Yeah, these are bookended in the book, by the way. First
Absolutely.
chapter on the memorial, 9/11 memorial. The last chapter is on the memorial process in Norway.
So a brief summary, which is, as Alice introduced it, July 22nd, 2011, a lone terrorist sets off a car bomb, a truck bomb, at the government center in Oslo. 8 people are killed there. But then, dressed as a police officer, he goes off to this island 40-odd kilometers away. The island is the home of the summer camp of the Labor the Labor Party's youth movement, which is filled with kids literally pitching tents and camping.
About 500 kids on the island.
And off he gets to the boat. In any case, he goes with weapons and begins a killing spree on the island. Ultimately, 69 people, most of them children, are killed on the island.
Another 250 injured badly, many of them.
So the Norwegians talk about how soon is too soon. This is now 2011. They are almost immediately talking about what they can do by way of a memorial. And yet, as James describes in the book, They don't really have their own memorial tradition of this type to draw on. Now, there are a number of memorial projects, but the one that I want to focus on is the one that is actually on the island of Utøya, which is a 3-minute boat ride from the mainland. Because, well, you'll describe the problem, but the problem is, whereas that number of victims are dispersed across the island itself, but there was particularly a building where a number of children were executed, and also a place within that building where a number of children were able to safely hide. And the challenge becomes the labor youth movement does not want to give up the island. It has a 60 or so year history full of meaning and life to that group, but they don't know how to go on in the context of what has happened there. So that sets the stage for you, but I want to focus in on the specific problem of this cafe building,
Sure.
as it was known.
I mean, the reason we're kind of involved at all, and by July 22nd this last summer, on the 5th anniversary, Cliff and Alice and I, along with Ed Lenenthal, were invited, in fact, to come and join the commemoration with them and the dedication of the memorial on the island.
On the island.
I had given a series of talks in Norway in 2010, September.
So before the attack.
Yeah, Tor Einar Fagerland, a memorial cultural, actually medieval historian, medievalist, who switched gears and went into kind of memory studies, very smart, had me come to Trondheim and give a series of talks and then go out to another memorial setting outside of Falstad, which was actually a concentration camp in Norway, in the north, where they had just dedicated a new museum. And we stayed in touch with Tor back and forth. And so this is September 2010, and July 22, 2011, it's horrible attacks. And I could hardly read the reports. I mean, it was so horrifying. The news covered a little bit here, but I was in touch almost immediately with Tor, just to tell him how sorry I was. He got letters from people the way that we got letters after 9/11. My European friends were flooding our email boxes at the time. And Tor felt this deeply, but he was already well known there as this kind of memorial specialist. And he responded, sympathetically, his heartbroken, devastated, and then just a couple of months later, asked if I would join a memorial project, a research project, and the government had actually turned to him to begin a research project on how this memorial process will unfold and how to do it. He said, we've never done it before. We have no idea. He goes, but I'll ask James, and James will ask others and bring people. And then we brought Tor here and introduced him to Alice and Cliff at the museum. I go, unfortunately, just the way that the 9/11 memorial process began with many family members and organizers going out and looking at other memorials. They went to Oklahoma, they went to Washington. I told Tor, maybe you're going to have to come and do a tour here. And so he went to DC, and he came here to New York, and he talked to Alice and Cliff. Everybody bonded very quickly. And then we all three ended up being part of this memorial process. And we were, the first time I went would have been October 2012.
So let me just interrupt and say if they can bring up the photo of the,
Utøya.
the first photo of the cafe building on the Norway slides.
And so this is, let's see, 2012, so this is just about a year after the attacks. They were trying to organize what to do, and they just didn't know. They had great spontaneous memorial events. Thousands of people coming out to the square, seas of red roses, on the square, main square, Church Plaza in Oslo.
Just to interject, I mean, the actual casualty numbers there are, on a per capita basis, more than the 9/11 victims here in the U.S.
Everybody in Norway knew somebody who was on that island that day. It's a very small country. I mean, the population
5 million or so
Yeah.
people. Yeah.
And so they picked me up and said, first we're going to go to the boat. And so Tor and Jørgen Vatnes, who was the head of now the process, the labor youth process, and Mari Abi West, who was on the island that day and was the only one to survive the swim off the island all the way there. Took me out in a little tuk-tuk boat, they call there, out to the island. And we did this tour. And got to the cafe building, and they began describing what had happened there. That the kids were told that this police officer had come to secure the island, so they would go up to the cafe building, which is their auditorium building, and they were to meet there for a briefing by the police officer. Well, the police officer, Breivik, began shooting people, adult security people, right after he got off the boat, and then firing at will on his way up to the cafe building where all these kids were waiting for him. And they began screaming and running, and Mari ran up to begin alerting them. And now all the kids are running, trying to hide, but it's a small island. It only takes about 15, 20 minutes to walk the entire perimeter of the island. He had all the time in the world because of the police response was hopelessly inept. And he got there and he killed, I'm not sure what the number was, he shot 23 and I think maybe 17 killed in the cafe building in cold blood. He had to look into their eyes and shoot them so they knew why he was shooting them. And he explained that multiculturalism had gotten out of hand. This was the Labor Party, Youth Labor Party was the incubator for multiculturalism. He was an ideologue. He knew exactly what he was doing, not crazy at all. Had planned this for months and months. And so this cafe building, which had been their great, there was a place for parties and speeches, and every Labour prime minister who'd ever served in Norway had been in that Labour youth camp and had been in this cafe building and had heard other prime ministers. And in fact, on that day, Gro Harlem Brundtland, the first woman, female prime minister, Labour prime minister, had given a speech on that day, July 22nd, and he had planned to get there before she had left the island to capture her and to decapitate her in front of all the kids. That was his plan. That was in his notes. He took so much time getting there that she had left the island, so she wasn't there to do this, but he basically wanted to decapitate the head of the Labour Party and to kill her children, the children of Labour, to wipe out, exterminate the party from Norwegian politics. So several of these kids were killed in this cafe building. I went back and met with family members, and an architect they had commissioned to begin designing what to do. And I looked at the plans, and this is just a year and a half out, and they had planned on scraping the island completely clean of all the buildings, wiping it all clean. I said, you can't do that. I mean, I'm not here actually to tell you what to do. You brought me, and I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm here only to give you company and try to figure this out with you. But I did say, you can't do that. There's got to be a way to keep historical artifacts intact and to regenerate the island, but you have to do it around the memory of what happened here. And
So let's go inside the building on the next slide. And
so that was what the building looked like. So the next year I came back, and they had decided, in fact, that they were going to try to figure out how to save some part of the building, because, as the family members reminded us all, they had built shrines there. The family members did these. And so, in effect, the family members had already enshrined this building. And when informed that they maybe were now going to demolish the building, the family members said, you're going to have to demolish us too. This is where our children were killed, and this is where we go to visit, and we lay flowers and candles here.
And you can see the bullet holes in the wall. Those are still intact.
And so at this particular one, it's still a very hard story to tell. We went back, this would have been summer 2014 maybe? 14? I think it was a summer that we all went on separate trips.
Yeah, that's right, that's right.
And, actually, it might have been the summer that you opened the museum. It was May 2015, is that right? 14, May 2014. So now we go back and we're trying to figure out, what do you save of the building and how and why? And as I'm walking through, I'm with a survivor from that day, Hilda, and Hilda and I are standing in front of this little shrine. And I said, did you know her? She goes, yes, I held her when she died. And
this photograph here.
Yeah.
So we can go to the close-up of this photograph, yeah.
And I said, so where were you? She goes, I was here. And she took my hand and led me into a lavatory, a toilet stall. She goes, I was hiding here with 3 others. There were 4 kids in each of these 3 toilet stalls. We closed the doors. We could hear him come through shooting and calling out, come out, come out. I'm here to help you, and then shooting. I go, why didn't he fire through the door? And she said, because he had to see every one of his victims' face when he shot them. So I realized at that moment that, I said, then what happened? He goes, well, then the shooting stopped. An hour later, the police came and identified themselves as policemen, and we finally came out. And he said, who's in charge here? And I said, I'm a counselor. And she goes, please take care of this girl here who is bleeding to death. And so she held the girl there. And then I realized that if you're going to save the shrine where she died, you need also to enshrine refuge and safety. And so I went and got Tor and told Tor the story, and then we knew that we would have to enshrine the lavatory. The lavatories where probably 12, 15 kids' lives were saved, where they hid. And you would also have to leave these enshrined places of death, which the parents themselves had built to remember their children. And so that became the seed of the memorial project, which ended up being a tenting, if you will.
Yeah, we can go to the next slide.
Of the entire cafe building. Leaving these sections intact and protecting the rest of the building with kind of symbolic numbers of poles and things here. So this was what was dedicated this last July.
This past summer. And if we go next, you'll see, you see the structure around and the part of the cafe building that's preserved within that structure.
Yeah.
And that's, by the way, Tor Einar.
That's Tor Einar Fagerland, who ended up writing a pretty incredible timeline based on text messages on the kids' phones, which were found being behind. And that was how they reconstructed a lot of the crime in the crime scene.
Yeah. Let's talk about the difference now of not the process, but the kind of memorial. So scale is obviously important. Sure. The intimacy of this is vastly different than the scale of what we had here. But how do the 2 different memorials reflect 2 different cultures, or do they come together in a particular way that, in spite of their outward differences, connect them?
Tor was shaped, Tor's ideas were shaped very much by what he saw here, I know, influenced very much by this museum and how you've organized everything here. The victims need to be remembered with photographs and their faces, which was a big part of the exhibition at the Government Center in Oslo. The victims are all humanized. They're remembered humanly proportioned for who they were, where they came from, how they lived, not being reduced to the moment of their deaths, which is really important and something that you do here so well, and something that has been very important to me working with Holocaust memorials around the world, and advising both the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and how they do things at Auschwitz as well, even Yad Vashem. So those things have in common, and you actually got to show him a little bit how to do that and how to think about that. There is a memorial, there was a memorial competition to be sited just off of the island, a peninsula pointing toward the island, which was to be like the national memorial where the public could go, because the island is technically a private island, and the only people who really go there by invitation or members of the Labor Youth Party. And this memorial, very much the winning design for the memorial built on this peninsula, Jonas Dahlberg, a Swedish artist, proposed what he called memory wound, in which he's taken a slice out of this peninsula. The peninsula is like a long, skinny finger pointing right to Utoya, the island. So about halfway up this peninsula, he's taken a chunk out of it. He wanted to move all the flora and the rock and the stone and the soil back to Oslo to create a memorial garden to unite these two places, and then to polish, like the size of a geode, like the size of Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial, to polish those sides and then to put the names of the victims on them. And it won the competition, international competition, a well-run design competition. I think it's kind of a beautiful, touching memorial. You would go through it. It's, in effect, created a little island that you can't really get to. So you would walk up the peninsula, and then you would view both Utoya and the pointing, now separated finger pointing to the island, and see the victims' names right there. But the local townspeople feel accused by this memorial, and they've resisted it, and they've actually stopped the process cold. The Norwegians aren't really big on conflict, kind of bury
Which has
these
its
things.
advantages. Let's acknowledge that.
And so this part of the process is actually shut down right now while they're waiting to see how to do it. But what's very interesting is that these local townspeople, they tend to be conservative country people, but in fact, they were among those who rescued many of the kids swimming off the island that day. There's no shame, but they feel like their landscape has been profaned. Their beautiful little fjord and island have now been profaned, and that their homes have now been profaned in some way, and they don't want this in their midst. It says, we didn't ask this guy to come here. He came here and violated us too. And living so close to it in a funny way, they said, we don't want to be reminded. So they have a little bit of that same problem. The ones who live closest are kind of the last ones to want to visit a space that reminds them of something they can't forget every day.
It's really remarkable because, in fact, talk about how soon the expectation from a memorial was created after the event. It was almost instantaneous after the event that they, without knowing how, that they would go ahead and do it.
Yeah.
Let's see if we can take a question or two from the audience. And I would ask, hang on one second, we'll get you a mic, pass a mic to you. Just over here, please, in the middle.
Thank you. That was really fascinating. It's more an observation. I want to ask you about how memorials change over time, because visiting this memorial, the 9/11 memorial, when you had to go through security and it was surrounded by fence, had a whole entirely different feel than now when it's just open. And it changed the nature of how you experience this memorial, and profoundly for me.
Sure. It was just a fact of life that with all the construction and staging, in order to make people safe, they had to have these kind of the barriers and the entry places, because the rest was just a construction site. But the experience, you're right, is absolutely changed. And obviously for the better, because we had always envisioned it as being an open plaza, accessible from all directions. And that was the whole point of bringing it to grade. And I know a lot of people at first thought, was it always going to be this way? Like these bottlenecks at security gates? And fortunately, it's not. And when all the construction staging is gone, the museum too is going to be a little bit more, if you will, exposed and very much knit into the fabric of downtown. And the experience is very, very different. But that's always at these different stages of construction, the experiences are different. So when we were down in the voids, as shocking as that was, that experience is actually fortunately receded now and been replaced by the experience of standing up near near the parapets with the names and watching and seeing it like everybody else does now. But one of the great gifts, I guess, in the kind of abstract design or geometrical designs is that they're built with future generations' ability to come here and remember for their reasons in mind. They're a little bit underdetermined in their abstraction. They're anchored. This memorial is anchored in the historical memory of the day here in the museum, the record of the day, which in a way is a historical foundation for an otherwise abstract design, in the footprints. But this design will accommodate every new generation's reasons for coming to it, even as the city continues to evolve around it. In 50 years, it will remember differently, from the way it does now. And I think contemporary artists and architects are very self-conscious about building into these designs the capacity to adapt over time, the way they do.
See one more. Brenda, just hang on 1 second for the mic.
Yeah, I was fascinated, especially since I've been to Norway and I have Norwegian friends, to hear about that process as well. I'm a volunteer guide for leading tours out on the Memorial Plaza for the 9/11 Tribute Center. I don't know if you've had an opportunity to go on one of our tours, but the premise of that is that people who have a personal connection to 9/11 tell their stories within the context of talking about the building of the memorial and the meaning of the memorial. And, one of our guides for that was what happens at Hiroshima. I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about the intersection of personal stories to rock and water and grass, and whether you think there's any place for that continuing here, how you would see that evolving maybe out into the future, if you considered that when you built the place.
Are you saying that on your tours you often you have survivors of the day?
Everyone
every shape and size.
Everyone who leads a tour has a personal connection. So it's family members, first responders like myself, survivors from the building, residents of the neighborhood, people who came here and volunteered starting with the day of 9/11. So everyone has a personal connection, and they weave their personal story into the tour. That's what goes on at Hiroshima. And as those people are dying off who had the personal connection, they are training docents to tell their stories exactly as they told them.
I mean, with the passing of generations, I know the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum has been weighing this for years. They used to also have survivors leading groups through, and they've been asking for what happens when the last survivor's gone. Well, do we have video testimony? Is that the same? And I guess the answer is that it's not the same, and these stories, personal stories, are probably irreplaceable. These people, who have these personal connections to the day will be around for a while, but eventually they will also pass. And the next generation, people who weren't here, will have to pick it up in their way. And I guess they will do that by making these stories their own. And they might be the experiences they had with these early docents. I know, I always remind my students that, because I was born, in 1951, I don't have direct memory of World War II or the Holocaust, but I have deep, explicit memories of hundreds of hours in the company of survivors, hearing their stories. And I have deep memory of my experiences in these sites, these memorial sites, and the reading and the film and the photography. And so that's all I can actually tell are the stories of my experiences in the company of these mediations, if you will. And it's really okay. And for people who make these stories their own, to turn around and share them, is still sharing their experience. I think of Art Spiegelman's, Mouse, that graphic novel, commixture of image and narrative, is telling Art's story, Art Spiegelman's story of hearing it from his father. And that's what it is, and it's really okay. That's all we have, our generation. And right now, we've got a generation of people with direct experience of the events who tell the stories, and I think we need to treasure them, treasure those stories, get them heard. And this has got to be by design, right? Yeah. I mean, you've obviously designed it this way, and it's fantastic. And I think it's been done so well at Hiroshima, and it's been done so well at the Holocaust Museum. It's being done so well here. It is a model for others. I know in Norway, the family members really can hardly talk about it, and there are only a few people like Mari who have the composure, to tell the stories of what happened on that day. And they ended up recording those stories, and that's part of the exhibit now at their government center. Maybe a dozen of the kids and people who survived that day telling their stories, and these are harrowing stories that they told on camera. And thank God, because you just wouldn't want them to have to repeat these stories over and over again. So what you're doing on the plaza is just fantastic, and I haven't been led through by them. I mean, we have jury members, Paula Grant Berry is a family member who was on our jury, and so we've got to know her story very well. The firefighter stories we got to know very well. And I have to say that there were three kind of life-altering public events where we were, as jurors, put on a stage during this design competition. And we listened to the stories of family members 3 different times. Our job was not to say anything. It was just literally to be informed by all these hundreds of family members' stories of who they lost, how wonderful they were, who they were, what they would like to have remembered by them, all these things. And our job was to be informed by it. And it was maybe the most difficult part of the experience. But we were now responsible in some ways for finding a forum that would hold all these stories in one place. But hearing the stories was maybe the most important part of our job as memorial jurors. So extending them on the plaza right now is just fantastic.
Let me just say, Brenda, at the risk of intruding, I mean, Brenda's story, which I have heard, of her service as lieutenant in the FDNY is really remarkable. And it's not easy to tell these stories from yourself, and I know from your colleagues, but part of the service, if you will, is the continuing willingness to do that. And we've been very grateful here when you've done that, and I'm sure out on the plaza with the Tribute Center tours as well.
It can't be easy, so just thank you for doing this.
That's the time we have. We have scratched the surface. There is so much more in the book, and if James is willing, I'm sure you can get a copy for him to sign just outside. And I will say, because of the work he's done, if we think of the negative space of that, if it hadn't been done, we'd be in a very different state in relation to the memorial that was created here and many of the others. So please come back for other programs. Please think of becoming members. A couple of you actually did become members tonight. But think about joining the museum, because that supports these programs. But please, above all, help me thank James Young.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris. Really appreciate it.